I recently watched an Ian Roberts video where he painted a beautiful landscape with lots of rich greens. If you're not familiar with Ian, in my opinion, he's one of the top teaching artists on YouTube. I noticed the color palette he was using to get all those beautiful greens was quite different than my typical palette. I was so inspired I decided to try this mostly green landscape using his color palette. This video is all about what happened next. Stay tuned. Let's jump right into it. Here's the palette Ian was using. I'll also put this list in the description box below the video. While he was using regular oils, I'm using Cobra water mixable oils. I already had similar yellows and a warm and cool red that were very close to what he was using, but I did have to purchase some additional colors to make this work: Dioxazine Purple and Phthalo Green. The Cobra line doesn't have those two colors, so I ordered them from Winsor & Newton's water mixable line. The main color that I would not substitute is the Chromium Oxide Green. He treats that almost like a mother color, a central color that has other colors added to it to get his full range of colors. So if nothing else, make sure that that one is the same. Since the scene I'm painting includes a muddy creek, I've added burnt sienna to my palette. Here's my palette laid out. I'm using a glass palette that's tinted gray, and you'll notice I've started with my cool yellow in the upper left-hand corner, moving to my warmer yellows. They're the two reds that were close to his reds. I substituted a Cad Red Medium for his Cad Red Light, and I substituted a primary magenta for his Alizaron Crimson. Then we go around to Ultramarine Blue, Dioxazine Purple. Then there's that all-important Chromium Oxide Green, and finally the Phthalo Green. And of course, I've got a long string of titanium white on the left side that you're not seeing, and I did add some burnt sienna when I got to the creek. So again, the particular video of his that I was watching is called Alla Prima Painting, or How to Get a Painting Right the First Time. So it's possible that he uses different color palettes for different paintings, but this came from this particular painting, and I loved it so much I was taking notes as he was talking about how he was mixing these different greens. So let's start with the darkest darks. Okay, so we have our lemon yellow, yellow deep, yellow ochre, my two red substitutes, my warmer lighter red, my darker bluer red, ultramarine, dioxazine purple, the chromium oxide green, and the phthalo green. And I'm going to go ahead and pre-mix the different colors that I heard him describe. Of course, he was tweaking things continually. He didn't make individual piles, but it helps me, and I think it'll help you. So we're going to start with the super darks first, which is a little bit of phthalo green and a little bit of his alizaron crimson. I'm using my red substitute. Of course, alizaron is a very dark, transparent color. That phthalo, and he would also, to his super dark, he might use a touch of the ochre, a touch of the blue to tweak it. But let's just see what this looks like, just those two colors. Wow, it looks like a black. It's a beautiful rich black. So rather than putting a black on your palette, you can use something like that. Wow, that's really beautiful. All right, the next color that we're going to do is a shadow color. And for that, and of course, the proportions that you use could be darker, lighter, warmer, cooler. So there's a lot of wiggle room in all these, but he starts with the chromium oxide green. And again, I would refer to that sort of as the mother color for all these. Then he adds ultramarine blue. I'm going to use less blue than the green. And he uses some dioxazine purple. I'm going to use less of the purple than the green. And let's just see what we get. Of course, the more blue and the more purple, the darker it'll be. But gosh, this is already just such a beautiful, rich shadow color. So let's see what that looks like. That still is reading very dark. It almost looks like a charcoal. Let me add a little more green to it. I'm going to pull some out to the side. You know, I usually have sap green. I always have sap green on my palette. This is the first landscape painting I think I've ever done without sap green, because it does give such a super dark, rich green. So let's see what that, so I've added more of the chromium oxide. There it is. Now that's pretty close to a sap green. I think that's absolutely beautiful. So that could be, you know, and think about as you have lighter greens on top of these, as foliage is on top of these shadows, how beautiful is that going to be? I absolutely love that. All right, let's go into lighter colors where he is going to have some foliage in sun. Again, he starts with the chromium oxide green, and let's start with the yellow ochre. And then, of course, the lighter you get, the lighter your green's going to get. So let's put some yellow ochre in with that. And this is where you might want to put a touch of a red to just neutralize that. I'm going to put a little touch of my bluer red in there with the yellow ochre. I really like mixing things on glass. It's just smooth and I like the sound of it. Isn't that funny how we are? So let's see. So that's still a very dark, neutral green, but definitely lighter than this. And one thing I noticed in Ian's paintings that were so beautiful is within the foliage, he would have some very subtle value changes. So it wasn't like there was just super dark next to super light. He would have a number of values in there, and it just really made a lot of difference in how effective it was. I love that. So let's take this same pile and let's add some of the yellow deep to it. Let's see what we get. So remember, this has some ultramarine, has a little bit of our bluer red. I'm going to put a little bit more green back in there. And this shifts it to more of an olive green. Still fairly dark. I think that's just beautiful. Very believable green. All right, let's warm it up a little more. Let's take some chromium oxide green again. Let's use our medium yellow, and let's use a touch of our warmer red, just a little bit. These reds go a long way. They can really overpower your pile pretty quickly. So let's see what we have there. That's still pretty dark. I'm going to now add a bit of my lemon yellow to that same mix. Just lighten that up a little bit. Slightly lighter. I don't know if you're seeing that on camera, but we're getting a beautiful range. And finally, let's take our chromium oxide green and just put the lemon yellow in there. It's a pretty bright, strong green. It doesn't look very natural. I'm going to add a touch of our Cad Red Light, our Cad Red Medium to that. And see, I got too much of the red in there. It doesn't take a lot. I'm going to add a lot more of our lemon. Still looking pretty dark. I'm going to add a little white at this point too. That'll really kick it up. Probably got too much in there, but put a little green back in. Just to let you see the range that you can get with these. And of course that cools it off a lot. I want to show you, let me put a little more of this lemon yellow on here. I'm going to show you, he got some really beautiful fresh greens in the sunlight. So let me take a little of this. Try this again, much more yellow than the green. So you can get vibrant green. So I'm not neutralizing that with the red. Look how beautiful that is. And now let me add a touch of white to that pile. These are the colors I would tend to paint with. I just paint with brighter colors, but yeah, I think that's just really beautiful. And so imagine these colors layered on top of some of these darker colors. So this is the range that you can get just from these few colors. And of course, if you continued to play with this, you could get a lot more color combinations. But as you see me adding colors to the second layer of our painting, these are the colors I'm drawing from. And so, yep, let's get started. Well, I just realized as I was filming, you weren't seeing these lighter colors at the bottom. So here are this is our Chromium Oxide green and the lemon, and there I've added some white to it. So I was just saying you can get some very perky greens using this combination. Beautiful string of colors. Let me show you also, I did this string the other day. And that'll show you again. These were just different colors that I got, again with this same color palette. Those look a little fresher. I added more yellow to those, but some beautiful greens, some beautiful darks. Really like this palette a lot. In Ian's Alla Prima video, he was using one layer of thick paint. He did not use a thin underpainting, and he did not use a medium. I don't know if it's the Cobra paints or it's just me, but these paints feel too thick and draggy to use without something to aid the flow. I decided to use Cobra's thinner to put in a thin undercoat, and then used a medium to put on the second thicker layer. I prepared this canvas by using gesso mixed with a yellow ochre acrylic paint. And so now I've made my darkest dark using that Dioxazine Purple and Red, and I've added thinner to it just like you would use Gamsol or something if you were using regular oils. And I'm looking at my photo and I'm just identifying those darkest darks, and I'm starting to put those in. When I got to the water, I used the same process as the land. I was using a thinner with my paints. I identified the darks in the reference photo and began laying them in. I'm not going to spend a lot of time showing you the water because I changed it a lot when I went over it with the second thicker coat. I probably overworked my water, but I love to go back and forth horizontally and vertically, adding in touches of color until it's just right. So this is the next day, and the paint has dried somewhat, but it's still workable. And I started going in and adding some more highlights to the creek. You're going to see me towards the end. I ended up adding a lot more color into it. I just felt like it looked kind of dull and uninteresting, but I wanted you to see I lay things in basically vertically, and I go back and forth with my brush, and then I'll make some horizontal lines to look like it's on top of the water. But I'm going to rework this a lot more at the end. But now let's get on to the second coat on the land. This is where it's very helpful for me to have my colors pre-mixed, because I can look at my photograph, I can see where the lightest lights are, I can identify that with the lightest light on my palette, I can look at that next value, there it is on my palette. It's very simple that way, and I think it's a little faster and it's a little easier to focus on the painting without constantly stopping to mix colors. So I was using a filbert brush at this point, and I started getting things a little dotty looking at the top. One of the things that I love about Ian Roberts' work that is not true of my work is he is great at blocking in big shapes and staying true to that, where I tend to get kind of lost in the weeds sometimes. So I did go back and rework those leaves so they weren't so dotty. But here I'm putting in some foliage right in front of that dark. And look how beautiful that is. It just pops. If that had been a green in the background, it wouldn't have been nearly as effective. And again, this is where it was so helpful and easy to have my values, my colors already pre-mixed. I could just look at that photograph and drop them right in. I like to show you my mistakes in my paintings, and I felt like that line was just so straight, that bank. I thought it was just really uninteresting and was taking away from the painting. So I took a little tool and just scraped back a lot of that oil, and then I just started wiping it down, and I wiped it back down as far as I could get it. And then I put a more interesting shape in that bank. So don't be afraid to just stop if something's not working. And if you're in acrylics, you can paint over it. If you're in oils, you can scrape it off, wipe it down, and start over. I was really glad I made that change because I think it ended up with a much more interesting painting. This is one of those places where I put the photograph away and I just looked at the water and the painting, and I felt like it was too dull. And I started really getting out my bright greens and adding it in and putting some darks in. And I was so glad I did. The water ended up being beautiful, so much more interesting, richer, beautiful greens. Again, I basically put things in, kind of depends on the scene, but I basically put water in vertically and then run some horizontal stripes on top of it. Here's a better view of what's starting to happen with that water with more color in it. Just love it. You can also see where I've added in some burnt sienna on the left and right, just kind of gives that muddy look. And see how the bank on the left corner cuts back in. I think that's a lot more interesting and attractive. Here I'm using a wider flat brush, putting in that foliage at the top on the right. And again, I'm just looking at the color strings that I've already made. I'm looking at my photograph, and it's just so easy to go in and pick out those values. I love this dark purpley shadow color underneath, and I'm trying to leave a little bit of it But in here I'm putting those highlights. Isn't that beautiful? And it's just so easy when you already have those colors pre-mixed. Just love what's happening with this. There's my photograph again. And as I move over to that right bank, in the photograph, it was very, very dark. And I think one of the things that attracted me about this was the great lights and the great darks, which is often a real prerequisite for me in a photograph. And there you can see that from the front where we are. It's coming together nicely. So as I start on that right-hand bank, I'm just going back to my darkest darks, that one or two steps above the very darkest. So you don't see a lot of contrast there, but I am leaving some of those super dark showing underneath. So you're aware there's foliage, but it's very subtle. And what that does in the final painting is it draws your eye back to the highlighted areas. The highlighted areas wouldn't be as special or as much of a focal point if the right side of the painting also had a lot of color. You know, this was one of those paintings that I was so excited at the beginning of it because Ian Roberts had given me permission to use his name and his color palette. I was excited about the photograph that I was using, but when I got into the painting, I just didn't feel like it was coming together, and I was feeling so discouraged. And here I was filming it and just had such high hopes for it, but it was a real lesson in perseverance because like the last 20% of this painting, all of a sudden, it just came together, and I absolutely love it. One of my favorite things about this, to my surprise, is the Dioxazine Purple. Purple is not a color that I particularly like. I don't wear it, I don't have it in my home, but normally I would have used a sap green and maybe some ultramarine to darken it for this dark place, and it would not have been nearly as effective with these light greens popping against it. I just love the effect of this, and I don't feel like when you look at it, it screams purple. You just know it's this really dark, rich color. I just love it. And at the end, while the painting was still wet, I went back in with Dioxazine Purple, and I just went in and started adding it back into a lot of places, and it just is still wet. And it just added form and shape again. I went in and add a little more detail to this outline where the light green is. And in the photograph, the water was not particularly colorful, and I felt like it looked really dull and uninteresting. So I just got where I put the photograph aside and I just looked at the painting and like, do I like it as a standalone? If no one could see the photograph, do I like the way the painting looks? And I felt like the water looked very dull. So I went in and added a lot more color to it, and I'm a lot happier with it. I think that looks a lot more interesting. So yeah, I think it was kind of like that long shot horse that sort of pulled out at the last minute and got across the finish line. So I hope this has inspired you maybe to try some different colors. Even if you don't do the entire palette, try incorporating some Dioxazine Purple as your dark, or using Chromium Oxide Green as your kind of mother color. I'm just very pleased with this. I'm sure I'll be using it again. If you would like a free download of some of my favorite colors, which was done before this painting, I'll have to update it and include these. You can go to my website. I've got a free download there, and I show you how the different applications of how I use some of my favorite colors. For example, burnt sienna is a color that I like a lot, and you think, well, what could you do with burnt sienna? There are tons of things you can do with it, so check that out. Also at my website, I have a number of courses and shorter tutorials, all very inexpensively priced, on clouds, florals, landscapes. Would love for you to check that out as well. And as always, if you would hit subscribe and a thumbs up and leave a comment, it goes a long way in helping this little channel to grow. I appreciate your time. I don't take that lightly. God bless.